Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Sageta, Ahlan Bika, Sogathe, Shagutu, Karibu to yet another Equidem event. My name is Dome. I work with Equidem as a researcher based in Kenya. Before I continue, just a quick note that today's event can be followed in English, Arabic, Hindi, and Nepali. Let me guide you on how to do that shortly. I'll just share my screen real quick. At the bottom of your screens, there's a globe icon indicated interpretation. Please locate it and select it. Once you select it, you have English, Hindi, Arabic, and Nepali version. For all audience who prefer the English version, kindly do not change your settings. The rest, please select the language of your preference. Once you select the language of your preference, at the bottom, there's the mute original audio option that allows you to mute the English language such that you only hear the language of your preference. If you do not mute, you will hear two voices in your earpiece. Kindly mute original audio as highlighted in the red circle at the bottom of your screens, as marked on your screens. If for whatever reason you have challenges doing the following, please look at your chat options and the same instructions will be availed to you so that you're able to follow us as we walk through this launch together. Thank you so much. It's a great honor to have you join us this morning, evening, and afternoon from all corners of the world. Today, we are pleased to launch Exposed, Discrimination and Forced Labor Practices at Expo 2020 Dubai. This report and this launch is a culmination of a lot of research work over weeks during the Expo Dubai 2020. Today's event will be approximately an hour long with presentations by my Equidem colleagues and reflections from some of our guests, and an opportunity for questions at the end. We hope you'll engage us as much as we'd like to engage you all. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. The session will be recorded and published afterwards on the Equidem website and the YouTube channel. This report is accessible on the Equidem website. A link will be shared in the chat box and at the end of this launch event. There will be a short question and answer session after the presentation. If you wish to ask a question or make a comment, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. We are happy to receive your questions at any stage throughout the launch, and we'll try to answer as many as possible. We'd also love to hear from you on our social media. If you are tweeting about the event, please tag us at Equidem.org. The same tag will be availed on the chats. I would now like to hand it over to Mustafa Qadri, our founder at Equidem. Thank you so much. Sorry, Mustafa, you're muted. You're muted.
Sorry about that. It's an old habit, that. Thank you, Dome, for that introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the launch of our report today. Before we present our findings, I wanted to speak briefly about our organization, Equidem. Some of you may already be familiar with us, though many of you may not. Equidem is a human rights and labor rights not-for-profit, working globally and locally to promote the rights of marginalized communities, accountability for serious violations, and building the human rights movement. Our team of experts and activists expose injustice, provide solutions for the most intractable human rights challenges, and work closely with grassroots and regional civil society to empower the individual and the community. We are a unique organization because our teams are led by experts and activists entirely from the global south. All of our investigations are carried out by rights holders themselves, including factory workers, migrant workers, and members of minority groups. I'm very proud to say that the interviews with workers at Expo contained in the report we are launching today was carried out by current and former migrant workers with support from our experts. Without their courage and hard work, the victims of racial discrimination and forced labor at Expo could not have been given a voice. Human rights are under threat like never before. State and private actors actively curtail rights protections, and in many countries, the public is openly hostile to human rights and the individuals who promote them. But it is also a time of tremendous excitement and potential. The world has never been more interconnected, and public consciousness around serious human rights abuses, like discrimination and modern slavery, have driven conversations about the appropriate conduct of governments, private businesses, and society at large. To meet these challenges and opportunities, the human rights movement must break out of its silos and ensure its actions are evidence-led, offer a vision for a better society, and put the rights and experiences of affected individuals and groups at the center of its work. Equidem's mission is to actualize this vision, recognizing that change is ongoing, requiring urgent and long-term effort, and must be collaborative, ethical, and transparent at all times. But of course, we cannot succeed alone. Only together with a shared commitment to human rights and dignity can we ever succeed. By joining us today, you've shown you have that commitment, but of course, much more is still needed from all of us. Thank you again for being here with us. I'll now hand over to my colleague, Dome.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. We really appreciated that context of the organization. I would now like to hand it over to our India director, Namrata Raju. And before I do that, we have a video that I would like you to all watch. And then our India director will gladly take you through the findings of the report. Thank you so much.
The Expo 2020 Dubai is a multi-billion-dollar mega project involving some of the largest businesses in the world and pavilions from 192 countries. But the reality for the tens of thousands of migrant workers who make Expo possible is very different. It combines long hours of work along with underpayment of wages, racial discrimination, and forced labor practices. Bhim from India, working for Cafe at Expo 2020 Dubai. Bhim never received the pay rise he was promised.
It's very tiring. I work from early in the morning till evening. They treat the staff here like slaves. It's modern day slavery.
Migrant workers are being subjected to violations of labor rights, including forced labor. The following conclusions are drawn from Equidem's investigation. 83% stated that they paid illegal recruitment fees and or had not received their wages or other benefits on time and in full. 37% reported 3 or more issues at work, which are indicators of forced labor. 20% reported 5 or more issues at work, which are indicators of forced labor. More than a third of the migrant workers interviewed, 37% said there was discrimination and or bullying in the workplace. Gesh, a woman from Kenya working at Expo 2020 Dubai.
I witnessed a lot of discrimination, especially dark-skinned employees who didn't have anyone to speak on their behalf when the company was looking to fire staff. Some of the workers were given redundancy, but especially among the Africans, they were given redundancy without pay.
Equidem also recorded incidents of discrimination in salaries, with Emirati nationals paid many times more in wages than migrant workers on the Expo 2020 Dubai. During the COVID-19 pandemic, migrant workers from Asia and Africa were disproportionately affected by redundancies, pay cuts, overtime, non-payment of wages, and late payments. They are also constantly subjected to abusive acts such as retention of passport, lack of access to a grievance mechanism, and other forced labor practices. Trade unions are illegal in the UAE, and workers who organize or seek to collectively bargain are at risk of persecution. On February 2nd, 2022, the UAE will have a new labor law promising better employment and labor conditions. But it does very little to address discrimination and lack of enforcement of basic labor protections that Equidem has identified at Expo 2020 Dubai. The United Arab Emirates must enforce basic labor protections, eliminate its discriminatory two-tier labor system, and decriminalize trade unions so workers have a voice in the workplace. Without these steps, the UAE's new labor laws will do little to address the country's labor exploitation crisis.
We hope you enjoyed the video, and I would now like to hand it to Namrata Raju, our India Director at Equidem. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dome, and good evening, good morning, good afternoon. My screen, apologies for that. Okay, so thank you all again for being here today with us during the launch of this important report while we speak about some very, very important issues. So to begin with, we're looking at the United Arab Emirates, which is an extremely oil-rich nation, one of the most or the 9 richest countries in the world by GDP per capita. So this is just to place it in context, what we're talking about. And why this report is particularly important is it's being launched on a day that new labor reforms come into effect, specifically the Federal Law 33. Now, this law promises that there are going to be wider protections for men and women workers in the world of work. And this is even more important given that a very sizable part of the UAE workforce is comprised of migrant workers, particularly who are low wage. So that is over 90% of migrant workers, over 90% of the UAE economy. In the way current labor laws, including the UAE labor laws, are enforced, and there are even sizable gaps in terms of governance. Our report has unfortunately uncovered many indicators of forced labor and racial discrimination against migrant workers. Now, again, as I said, these workers that allow this economy to function, which is why the trends that we are seeing here are extremely worrisome.
This is Mustafa speaking. Nam, just to let you know, with the connection, it's stopping a bit. You might want to maybe turn off your video and see if that helps. Otherwise, I can help you with the presentation.
Sure, no worries. So sorry about our technical glitches. If you give me a moment, I'll just turn off my video and get back to it. Thank you. Everyone can, please, someone can interject and interrupt me if the video is glitchy again. But essentially, what we're looking at here is that the UAE is here a nation which spends large amounts, which has had a big spend of money in terms of building itself up into an international business hub, attracting foreign tourists, and also has a sophisticated PR campaign that essentially paints a picture of a very modern, diverse, inclusive, and welcoming society. And why? So the question is, why does this report on the Dubai Expo matter? Just placing it in larger context, essentially what it does is it goes to the heart and soul of this image of the UAE being this modern, diverse, welcoming sort of behemoth, as it were. About 7 billion, it is a
Now, we seem to have lost you again, but if I can pick up where she was speaking, that basically what we're dealing with is a really massive project at Dubai Expo, where you have, as Nam was saying, $7 billion of trade is expected in that, a huge, huge organization. Now, I'm not sure whether you're able to connect to us again or not. I'm happy for you to continue, but if you can, I'll speak. So as Nam, apologies for that, everyone. So as Nam works out her connection, so as she was saying, is that we often hear about with Dubai in particular and the United Arab Emirates as being really the most international, the most sophisticated of the Gulf Emirates in the Middle East. And Dubai is really at the center of that. And within that, the Expo mega project is really critical to that. And as Nam was saying, is that this is a really wealthy project. It includes 192 pavilions from practically every country and every corner of the world. When you enter Expo, it has literally flags fluttering at the entrance from every country. So this is a matter of not just what's happening in Dubai and the Emirates, but in fact, the entire international community. And what we found in our investigations after a period of 6 months, including up till very recently. So these are very much things that we've documented right now as we speak. But over the last 6 months, with Expo ending on the 31st of March, is that in fact, whilst Expo itself is not only meant to be honoring the UAE's own labor laws, but has its own worker welfare standards that across sectors, construction, hospitality, cleaning, security, their workers were being subjected to what would be considered forced labor indicator practices. And also what we found was that workers were also being subjected to what would amount to racial discrimination. Now I see that, Nam, you're back on the screen. I don't know if you want to continue to jump in, but I was just painting a picture of both the context within which that we were doing our work. But over to you if you want to continue.
Yes, please, Mustafa, and thanks so much for that. So sorry to the entire audience. It's like that thing where you're preparing a lot for a big dinner, and that's when the dish that was your favorite dish that you were going to put up for everyone to eat, that's the one that you decided to burn right in the oven. So my apologies for that. Thank you for staying with us. I'll hop back into the presentation, but essentially, as Mustafa mentioned, one of the main findings of our report has been that there are forced labor practices and racial discrimination against these migrant workers who essentially comprise the very foundations of the, not just the Dubai Expo, but the larger Emirati economy. So I'm going to share my screen with you again. And just a second. Right, and hopefully it won't be too problematic here. So this is just a little bit of background on the Expo and in terms of the size of this, the venture that we're talking about, right? Like we're looking at 192 countries with pavilions, a $7 billion US trade fair. We have over 40,000 workers involved only in terms of the construction. So we're not even talking about now, in terms of what the Expo claims to be on the surface, is they talk about bringing cultures together and building a better future. But the reality for the migrant workers that we interviewed for this project, and especially kudos to our team on the ground and the workers who spoke to us, it was a very starkly different reality from the picture that is being painted here. So essentially the work that we are presenting to you has been collected over a period of 6 months. And workers that we spoke with, our team on the ground spoke with, heralded from a variety of sectors. You have hospitality, security, cleaning. So essentially workers across this entire umbrella. The main thing that we see and continue to see is that there is a certain degree of non-compliance with Emirati labor laws and Expo's own worker welfare standards, which we must say have attempted to actually, to some degree, even be a little bit better than the UAE standards at the moment in terms of labor laws. And one of the glaring gaps that we have is that trade unionism is very strictly prohibited in the UAE. I'll just very quickly look at the research methodology and then jump into the findings. So essentially, we spoke to a total of 69 workers through structured and semi-structured interviews. And they were from a variety of nationalities, both men and women. The main thing here that is of concern is that essentially these workers told us that they were really scared of some kind of reprisal or punitive action, either from their employers or from the UAE authorities. Now, in terms of our key findings, what did we find? We sort of alluded to forced labor earlier. So of the workers that we spoke to, 83% said that they had paid illegal recruitment fees. 37% stated that they had faced 3 or more issues at work, which essentially are indicators of forced labor in line with the ILO's indicators of forced labor. And despite these risks, dozens of women and men from Africa and South Asia, also the risks of speaking with us and the risks of actually working in a situation
Sorry about that. Again, Nam seems to have a connection issue, but just to continue with what she was saying is if you look at the statistics of the workers that we've interviewed, so we spoke to 69 workers in total, of those 30 in-depth interviews, one-to-one, confidentially, and the figures are really staggering. When you look at it, 25%, 83% of interviewees said that they paid illegal recruitment fees, itself a forced labor indicator. 37% reported 3 or more practices which are indicators of forced labor. And quite frankly, with the work, the investigations that we did, having already actually spoken to the organizers of Expo over the last 2 years, obviously we followed these things very closely. We were really shocked to learn the level of non-compliance. And when you compound that with the fact that workers were extremely worried about speaking to us, the thing to really stress to you is that these interviews were carried out in environments where it took a lot of effort, not only to build trust with workers, but also to make sure that workers were safe if they spoke to us. The fact that even with a relatively small sample size, that these issues are coming out across the board on the Expo with its much higher welfare standards than the normal law of the UAE really raises questions about not only what is happening across Expo, but also in the wider UAE. And so that for us was really a really big surprise. The other thing, of course, that we talk about a lot in this report, and I really encourage you to go through that report in detail, look at the details of what we've looked at, is that, and to really stress with that, what we have done is with the chapters of the report is put our findings in order of the actual standards that the Expo itself applies, showing that there is non-compliance. But the other thing that really stands out in this report is the amount of racial discrimination that workers are facing on Expo. And this presents itself in some really obvious ways and other ways which are also really shocking, but less obvious. The obvious ways where this presents itself is where workers are literally being paid less money for doing exactly the same job, where their job titles are the same, where the job specifications are the same. And especially where there's a variance between a national, an Emirati national doing a job and a non-Emirati national from a global South background, we see that the variance is incredibly high. And in that process of documenting that research, one thing that really struck us was, as I said, given the presence of practically every country on earth on Expo and the presence of some of the biggest international businesses on that site, including household names, the question has to be asked is surely in any other part of the world, if even just on that issue, there was this variance in salaries and benefits based on nationality, would this not be something that would be going to court? Would this not be something that would be an international scandal? The other question it raises is what due diligence has been taken by the international business community and these 192 countries that are represented as pavilions on Expo to address these issues that are clearly there as we see. And so I think for us, what is really important to really emphasize is on the one hand, with Expo, you have a country, United Arab Emirates, really pushing to promote international travel, really pushing for international business, trying to really make it accessible for the world to see it. And yet at the same time, paradoxically, also making it highly restrictive for workers to speak out about their issues. Now, in our conclusion and recommendations, I think we might end on this point, given the connectivity with Namrata, but and then of course we'll hear from our other guest speakers and then we'll open it up to discussion. But the really key thing to really take away, and we talk about this very clearly based on the data that we've collected, is that there simply is not adequate enforcement of existing labor protections in the UAE. So if today the UAE is installing a new labor system, on paper it has some very positive things about it. But the question isn't the new labor law. The question is, why is there this complete absence of enforcement of basic labor protections? The other thing that we really find is critical to the situation, linked to the fact that workers are so terrified to speak about their issues, even when they're quite mundane, issues like they haven't been paid their salary for a few weeks. But also that when there are other more deeper issues affecting thousands or tens of thousands or even millions of workers, is that in the absence of trade unionism, in the absence of workers being able to exercise their freedom of association rights, it'll be practically impossible for a country like the Emirates, with its over 9 million migrant workers, over 90% of its private workforce, to address these forced labor indicator practices. And so really our message is very clear. Obviously it is to the government, but it's also to the Emirates' international partners, which practically is every major business on the planet, that there is a significant forced labor and racial discrimination risk that cannot be washed away simply by passage of law or having very, on paper, very positive, strong standards and a very glitzy public relations campaign without active enforcement of law, removal of a discriminatory two-tier labor system, and literally removing the fact that trade unions are currently illegal. Without these key steps, then not just for the Emirates, but for its international business partners, the country is a huge modern slavery risk. I'll leave it at that, and I'll hand over to my colleague Dome to take us on to the other speakers. But again, thank you so much for listening to me, and to Namrata, and apologies for the slight technical glitches there.
Thank you, Mustafa. Thank you, Namrata. At least we were able to share these findings. And also, as I had indicated earlier, these will also be shared on our website. So look out for that, and our communication will be shared as well to have the actual report. I would now like to welcome Sharan Burrow, who is the Secretary General of the International Trade Union Confederation. Thank you, and Sharan, over to you.
Well, thank you to you, Mustafa, and all the colleagues, because this report is both timely and descriptive of the modern slavery practices we see in the UAE. It is indeed, as Mustafa said, produced by the words of migrant workers, those from indeed migrant countries. It is not just their voices, but the interviews and the production from this company represent the anger and the determination of voices and leaders in those developing countries to actually establish the international standards of decent work. The UAE has a choice about how they reform labour laws. They know they're not in compliance with ILO standards. They know they're not even in compliance with the UN's business and human rights principles, or imposing due diligence on corporations, or setting up the grievance procedures to effect the remedy that would make this a decent working environment. It always astonishes me, makes me actually very angry to see that the government claims that forced labour and trafficking is illegal, but it's almost as if they say it will be true, because no action is taken against these practices. And this report exposes this dramatically. This very wealthy nation has built its success off modern slavery principles, and they must actually reform, or the eyes of the world, with your organisation, with ours, with many other allies, but mostly with the voices of workers themselves, will continue to expose the dehumanising exploitation. You've heard the main report findings, with the majority of Expo 2020 Dubai workers interviewed facing forced labour practices, workers who are subjected to discrimination, racial discrimination and bullying, workers charged illegal recruitment fees, the non-payment of wages and benefits with no sanctions on companies in violation. There is no transparency of contract, no immediate redress through grievance or courts for non-compliance of those countries. These workers depend on the employer for almost every item of their survival: a contract, a visa, accommodation, the conditions under which they work, the payment or non-payment of wages, illegal fees. This is modern slavery. These are the conditions for modern slavery. Indeed, I was struck by some of the quotes, and I just pick out the Indian security guard who said, "They didn't provide a contract to me. I signed a contract paper and gave it back to the employer. The offer letter was described in English. All the official papers are explained in English and Arabic, and we don't get any written documentation in our native language." They could be signing anything with no rights or redress. And then, of course, the retention of passports, again, supposed to be illegal, but widespread, and again, no sanctions, as workers are not able to access, in too many cases, grievance mechanisms, even where they exist. Indeed, your report's findings accord with our own. The ITUC's annual Global Rights Index has rated the UAE with no guarantee of rights, the lowest category in our index, being a country of exploitation since 2014. These abuses occur right across the country. 700 migrants from Africa were detained and deported in June 2021, denied access to legal or medical support. 50% of construction workers surveyed in Dubai indicated that they did not receive their wages on time and were denied adequate overtime payments without redress. Workers report regular contract violations and irregularities. They pay thousands of dollars in illegal fees. Despite what the law says, there is an inability to change jobs, and wage discrimination is still based on nationality. The commitment to a minimum wage, there's no guarantee it'll be based on evidence so people can live with dignity, and it excludes, as all the laws announced this year do, in fact, domestic workers. So women migrants still are absolutely able to be exploited. We know that fear and intimidation of workers in the UAE can only be ended with workers having a voice in the workplace, freedom of association, a voice in shaping labour law reforms to address the problems, allowing workers to collectively document their cases and to have access to a transparent labour disputes mechanism. These are the only ways that we'll see genuine reform. It's time for the UAE to get serious about modernising its labour laws in line with the ILO standards, to engage in social dialogue, to treat workers as equal, and indeed as those people who have the right to organise collectively in the workplace. The shocking piece, I think, for everybody is that this report exposed those issues, but in particular, it exposed that there's no different, even in the global Dubai Expo event. This is indeed, Mustafa, a global event with global multinationals, some of the richest countries in the world and the richest companies in the world, but none of them taking responsibility to stand up to the UAE government, and certainly the UAE government not actually taking responsibility for either ILO standards or imposing business and human rights standards with due diligence, grievance or remedy on the companies operating in their country. So we know that the eyes of the world is on this massive event. They don't seem to, but I can only say thank you on behalf of all the workers there. Thank you for your due diligence, for your voice, and for the partnership that we know will be there as we fight to establish labour rights and due diligence with the kind of transparent system of labour courts and sanctions on violating companies that these workers deserve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharan. That was well put, well said, and it dug directly at the issues and the findings in a very detailed manner. I would now like to welcome one of our speakers, Bhim Shrestha. Bhim is a member of Shramik Sanjal, which is a Nepalese migrant worker network. Welcome, Bhim, and the floor is now yours.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm Bhim Shrestha. I'm a migrant worker and executive director of Shramik Sanjal. Shramik Sanjal is a migrant worker-led non-profit organization based in Kathmandu, Nepal. We serve as a voice advocating for the dignity and fairness for millions of Nepalese migrant workers, most of whom are low-income migrant workers in the Gulf countries and Malaysia. Thank you, Equidem team, for giving me this opportunity to speak in this event. As we all know, migrant workers are often forgotten and left behind from the mainstream migration and development work, which we will feel as a migrant worker quite dehumanizing. And this kind of opportunity allows us to speak and amplify our voices globally. So thank you again for this opportunity. As we all know that the contribution of migrant worker in the economic development of both the country of origin and country of destination is so significant because of their hard work and skill. The economy and major infrastructure projects like this Expo have benefited greatly. However, worker contributions remain unrecognized and they are often deprived of enjoying even the most fundamental of well-being that clearly explained by Equidem team, Namrata and Mustafa just before, and in their previous presentation, that worker found discrimination, wage disparity, non-payment of wages, live in poor condition, and their passport retention and payment of exorbitant recruitment fee, and etc., etc. These are not new phenomena, not new problem, but continued from so long, or as far as even my personal experience is evident, being exploited in some of forced labor, being as a migrant worker. And this Expo also could not go beyond the boundary to protect migrant worker from exploitation. The persistent deprivation, state-sponsored intimidation, and socio-cultural construct have alienated millions of migrant workers like me from exercising our freedom of choices and have made us vulnerable to form of forced labor, which is very concerning and serious issue. Yet, we fail to address from our end. So I, as a migrant worker, wish to have more inclusive participation, exposure to global dialogue, where we can raise our concern and amplify our voices in the global platform to ensure our right to live with dignity and work in safe and healthy conditions. I'm so glad that I have been part of this event today and put my thoughts forward, and want to conclude by saying that workers' right is the human rights. This should be respected, protected, and promoted, not just by the word, but by action. And this kind of finding help understand these issues in depth. So thank you, Equidem team, for bringing insight and access to the global audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhim. We appreciate your insights directly from your migrant worker experiences. Thank you so much. I would just like to remind our attendees and audience, kindly, if you have questions, please keep them coming. We have a lot of questions coming in. We'd like to have more. So if you have burning questions to encourage the conversations around the report, kindly keep them coming in. We are now at that juncture where we will tackle some questions from our audience, and I'll just open the floor to questions that you wanna flag up. So in the Q&A, we have questions that have already been submitted, but if you have a question you'd like to directly open up and provide as much context to, feel free to do that as well, as we sift through the questions in the Q&A to start providing you some answers. Yeah, so opening up the floor for questions, feel free. Yeah.
And Dome, while we're waiting for questions to come in, maybe I can make one really quick comment, which I think is really important. And then I actually had a question for Sharan and Bhim, who have joined us. And it's really, really honored to have you both there. But the first thing to say is that we've obviously written to a number of businesses that are present on Expo. At this time, we felt decided not to include their names, but it's something that we may consider doing in any sort of subsequent investigations that we do. But the reason why I mentioned that is that we also wrote to the government of the United Arab Emirates and also to the organizers of the Expo event itself, which is effectively a state-controlled entity. And we're really disappointed that for the second year in a row, because we did another landmark piece of research last year on the impact of the COVID pandemic on migrant workers in the Emirates and other Gulf countries. But for the second time, just like that report, the authorities have simply refused to respond to us. And we've sent it to the right channels. We know that they've received it. With the Expo organizers, we've spoken to the welfare unit of that organization quite a few times. But this is one thing that we see a lot of when it comes to the Emirates, is that they feel that they can hide in plain sight. That, as I said earlier, whilst the world is literally traveling, transiting through Dubai, is going there for holidays, there's all sorts of international business going on, that there'll be no scrutiny of their practices and therefore they don't need to respond. And so if you're on this call, if you are a journalist, if you are in business, if you are in civil society, or you're just a normal concerned citizen, it's really important that we hear your voice and that you make it really clear, just as you would ask questions about whether the phones that you're using have any issues with them in terms of ethically how it's sourced, about the clothes that you're wearing, about whether any children or any forced labor has been caused by that production. The same sort of questions, ethical questions, have to be asked about our links with the Emirates and Dubai. And so linked with that, question that I had for Sharan and Bhim, first for Sharan, is we know that the International Trade Union Confederation and the international trade movement is really pushing for greater scrutiny of the Emirates, as it's been very effective with Qatar in the past. The question is, how can we all help you? How can we help the trade union movement, given how we feel so strongly as Equidem, based on the data, that the lack of trade unionism is a big part of the problem? So what can we do? And again, with you, Bhimji, with Bhim and his colleagues running an incredible organization, Shramik Sanjal, a migrant worker network, itself a collective body. Same question for you, but maybe over to you, Sharan, first, and then to Bhim. We'd love to hear what you think about that. Not sure whether Sharan or Bhim are still there, but if you are, it'd be great to get your responses to that. Maybe the team can chase them up while we look at some questions. But Dome, are there any other questions that have come in? Oh, there we are. There's Sharan. Hi, Sharan.
Sorry, I just had a technical glitch. Can you?
That's okay.
I turned the computer off rather than on. Can you actually repeat the question?
Yeah, of course. So the question, Sharan, was for you and also for Bhim, was what can we do for people concerned about the labour rights situation in the Emirates to support what your organisation and the trade union movement is doing around both accountability for treatment in Emirates, but also to reform the situation? How can we help what you guys are doing?
It's exposure. If journalists listening can actually heed your call, Mustafa, because indeed all those people travelling through Dubai, there is no accountability at all because there's no exposure. So if we can start to take the stories of workers, they're the most powerful tools, and expose them through all the media sites, the formal media, social media. We need to put pressure on this government. But this period of time with the Expo is also a chance to put pressure on every government. Journalists from other countries can ask their government what they're doing to ensure that their companies, their pavilion at Expo is actually adhering to fundamental ILO standards of decent work. This is a moment of exposure. We all need to make the most of it.
Thanks, Sharan. That's really, really helpful. And it's great also to see that, it is fundamentally, there's simple things that we can do. And I think a number of the questions that have been posed have been around that. What can we do have a country like the Emirates, which doesn't have a lot of internal accountability? But what you've said is really, I think, the clear point. And that's to say that right now with Expo, but also beyond it, because they will continue with that project or continue with that event in a slightly restructured way, is that the Emirates is still open for business. It is still open for business with every major economy and every major business around the world. So it's about asking questions about what kind of human rights, labor rights due diligence is being done around projects over there, about putting pressure on those who are having projects in that country. Bhimji, I'm not sure whether you're with us now, but
yeah,
really
Mustafa, I'm listening. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you loud and clear. Would you like me to repeat the question that I posed earlier? The question basically was that, great, that, what the work that Shramik Sanjal does is so critical to supporting migrant workers from Nepal. Obviously, the people right at the front line of what's happening. What can the rest of us who are concerned about the situation do to help what the important work you and your colleagues are doing in the Emirates?
Thank you very much, Mustafa, for the question, and thank you again for giving me this opportunity to voice for the million of migrant workers. And as far as your question is concerned regarding what can the civil society or what other stakeholders can support to migrant workers, is that I somehow agree with the answer of Madam Sharan that to expose this kind of labor exploitation and the real condition and situation of migrant worker, and we as a Shramik Sanjal also doing the same, that we want to let people know that what is our condition being in the country of destination, working in the extreme condition, living in a poor condition. We want to share our personal stories and lived stories and experience to the global audience, so that the global audience also would understand from the depth of the migrant worker perspective, so that you can come up with a better solution to maybe bring a structural change or something like that. So we as a Shramik Sanjal, it's not only sharing the stories of migrant worker, but also being a friend of migrant worker, being ourselves in the real situation. We support them in emergency need, and also to amplify the voices of migrant worker. And another thing I would like to highlight is that we definitely know, and I think all of the audiences and participants in this event definitely know that the state structure and the intimidation that migrant workers fail in terms of raising our voices in the public forum or any other like public platform is very restricted, that we understand. And the local media also are heavily impacted by the state intimidation, and they also have to censor themselves, and this kind of report or this kind of exposure doesn't come into the surface. So people in the world are still not aware about what real situation of migrant worker is in the most of the major destination countries in the GCC in Malaysia. So we want to bring that into the surface. We want to bring into the major and mainstream dialogue, global dialogue, so that we can protect migrant worker rights. Thank you, Mustafa.
Thank you so much, Bhimji. Really, really appreciate those really important contributions. And also, I think something that what you've pointed out is the importance of making sure that we keep migrant workers at the forefront of the work that we're doing, of trying to expose not just the problems, but how do we support workers. And I think there's been also a few questions raised about this, that in terms of what happens to migrant workers after Expo and what are the ways that we can support them. To answer those questions, firstly, like I said earlier, whilst the actual Expo festival itself will end on the 31st of March, the area will continue. But what we've seen in the past with the pandemic, when the Expo was being organized, and this year with Expo starting, is that many workers don't get paid their wages. They face other issues as well, but then also workers are sent back home with those issues not resolved. And so one really big concern we have, because as Namrata showed in the presentation earlier, is that you have about 40,000 workers in total just on Expo, but likely many more on all the other projects that are servicing Expo. Many of these workers will actually be sent home. They'll be sent home, and very likely the risk is that they may not receive their end of service benefit, or they may have faced other exploitation issues that will not be resolved before they go home. So one really critical thing that can be done is around making sure that there are processes for workers when they return home to actually lodge their complaints. And for us to really lobby, particularly with the international business partners on Expo, to make sure that they informally, if not formally, are really calling on the authorities to at least address those issues. And I think that links to another question that was raised around the fact that, question about, do we know who are the sponsors of Expo? Do we know who's involved in that? And the reality is, in fact, it's very open. It's very public. They're very public about their international partners, about the celebrities who are promoting Expo, the major businesses that are present there. And so I think those particularly who are from the investor community, who are journalists, those who have in some way the ability to impact on these international businesses, it's really important that we hear your voice. And we'd really encourage you to go through our report, look at the different aspects of it. We've tried to provide as much infographics and visualization of worker testimony. Do share that forward, do have those conversations, and a really clear message to put to them, because we've provided very clear recommendations, is to ask them, what are you doing to address these points? What are you doing to address the discrimination in terms of work practices? What are you doing to make sure workers don't feel scared about raising their complaints? What are you doing by virtue of the fact that there aren't any trade unions to allow workers to have some kind of representation rights? So all those things are really, really important. And in fact, whilst there hasn't been that much attention on Expo and the Emirates as compared to Qatar with its World Cup, our strong sense and hope is that that attention will really increase, because in fact, you know, we're rightly concerned about what's happening in Qatar. There are issues there, as much as there have been also improvements. But if you look at the Emirates in pure numbers, in terms of the population of workers, the size of the economy, the range of international business relationships, it's a far bigger story, really. And so it's really about time that there was some attention on that.
And Mustafa, there are three simple things the government could do. The first is they could commit to aligning their labour laws with ILO standards, just as Qatar has done, and we would help. You know, that's the job of the international trade union movement, to actually support governments where they put laws in place that protect workers. But as well as the laws, you need the compliance, and building transparent labour courts where workers are not frightened because they're protected is absolutely fundamental. Businesses must be sanctioned for practices that are against the law. But equally, the government can act here. You know, Qatar's built a fund that actually will, when companies simply desert their responsibilities, when the government itself will then freeze the assets of the companies, get the money back, but in the meanwhile, support these workers from their own fund. That's the kind of responsibility government should be taking for migrant workers. And the third area of compliance is really around giving workers the respect of a voice. In Qatar, we've built the now and are rolling out workplace committees. They're elected, workers' representatives are elected by the workers there with the oversight of the ILO, and indeed they are joint committees with employers. That gives workers the right to a collective voice around issues. Now, we're not there yet with full implementation. We're still battling, as you said, Mustafa, the culture and the respect for these laws of the business community. But it's such a shift, and the confidence of workers has shifted. We have liaison officers in that country that work with the government, but also with the ILO, and assist and advise the workers. These things can be done. Even in Saudi Arabia, where they are not yet fully compliant with ILO standards, they have indeed set out a roadmap for an independent workers' committee to become an independent union. Their labour courts have been indeed developed to an extraordinary level of transparency. And when we've suggested, you know, things that could improve that, like collective action through mobile notaries at workplaces or online mediation, these things have been put in place. This government is not serious. So yes, we need to use the leverage of the international governments and companies for Expo, but we need to put pressure on the UAE to step up and be serious about decent work.
Thank you, Sharon, for that really, really important intervention. And I think also reminding us that, again, lots of labor rights issues, particularly with migrant workers across the Gulf, but there is good practice in the region as well. And you know, I think the one thing I'll end on before I hand over to my colleague Dome to provide you with the final information about where you can get the report is to really emphasize that the United Arab Emirates has deliberately cut itself off completely from any kind of scrutiny or even collaboration with the international partners that deal with labor rights issues, people like the trade unions, the International Labour Organization. And so it really falls on those who have those relationships with the Emirates, those who have links with the governments who have relationships with the Emirates, to really say that there's absolutely no excuse for the complete sort of blackout on any kind of scrutiny, because we know there are issues there. And to remind everyone that the reason why we have launched today is, whilst Expo is coming to an end, with the Emirates, we have a new labor law, which on paper has some very positive things about it, but does nothing to do with, does not deal with the racial discrimination of this two-tier system that will remain. It still makes trade unionism illegal, and our deep concern that there actually will not be an adequate enforcement of basic labor protection. So those are the sorts of things that we're dealing with. Expo might be ending in a few weeks, but these realities will still be there. And of course, the Emirates will continue to be having these mega projects that are completely dependent on migrant workers from across the world and from the most marginalized backgrounds. So again, would like to thank everyone for joining our launch today. A really important thing that I hope you can take this forward and support us to really raise the voice of these workers who have been affected. But knowing also on the positive side, if I can put it that way, is that there are concrete things that can be done. As Sharon has said, as Bhim has said, as we're saying, there are simple things that can be done, things that all of us perhaps on this call would take for granted that can be done. Thank you again for joining our call today. Really appreciate it. I just hand over to my colleague Dome to do the final thank yous and to provide information for where you can get our report.
Thank you, Mustafa. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Bhim. Thank you, Namrata, for the deep insight. I'm reposting the link to the report, and we will also avail it on our website. There are many questions. We try to answer as much as we could. In the report, we're actually addressing most of these questions. So feel free, access it, read it, interact with us, provide feedback, any information, because this is ongoing work, yeah? There's a lot of what next, what after the Expo, what comes next. Kindly have a look at that. Your active participation has been really, really a good thing to have, and we are really grateful that you found time to be with us, and your attendance. We take this in a special way, yeah? And all links, as I've said, will be availed on our website in the next coming days, and as well in our email to all of you invited members. We'd also like to circulate, the report, as I've said, please circulate it to all your contacts, to all stakeholders in the human rights and the labor rights space, on your social medias and around your networks. Kindly keep circulating this work, because it helps us see how much work has been done, who are the affected, and what's being done about it, and where redress could be found. Then the key thing here is we always look forward to welcome you to another event in the future. And we are very happy and really, really grateful that you found time to spend with us. With those very few remarks, I would thank you all, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Have a good morning, good evening, and good afternoon from wherever in the world you're joining us. Thank you so much.